Whenever students and scholars just in general discuss literature, we often use what we call critical lenses. And these are basically viewpoints that we can have when we look at poetry, when we look at literature, when we look at short stories, where we pay attention to specific aspects of the literature. And it really helps us kind of get different reading interpretations of the same material, but we can get different interpretation, different meaning, different just a different experience of a piece of literature depending on what type of critical lens we look at it through. That being said, I think that My Last Duchess is a poem that really invites what we call a psychoanalytic lens. Psychoanalytic criticism is criticism that pays attention to basically ideas of psychology. And I think that if we have those ideas in place, when we read the poem, we can actually get a lot of kind of very subtle implications that are pretty interesting. And so I'd like to go through the poem specifically, trying to pay attention to some of the psychoanalytic critique that we can do with Browning's My Last Duchess. So this worksheet here, I've just kind of tried to work out this poem. It's a complex poem. There's a lot going on here, even though the actual plot of the poem is pretty simple. But the Duke is a complex character, and his motivations, and the implications that the Duke is making about his last Duchess are all pretty complicated. So I basically have broken this up into some sections where I'd like us to go through. um I guess we have here basically four general pieces or four general categories to look at for this poem to help us best understand it. And let's start with the occasion and also the location for why the Duke and where the Duke is speaking. The Duke here is our speaker. There is an audience member. We find out that the audience the Duke is speaking to is actually an emissary of a count. And the emissary and the Duke are in the Duke's art gallery. And this is important because the art pieces we view in this gallery help us see the personality of the Duke. The art pieces are a bit of a reflection of how the Duke views himself and also how the Duke views others. The art pieces also show a symbolic control that the Duke is desperately trying to wield. Control seems very, very important for the Duke, and we find that that idea of control reflected in his art gallery. I have an office, and any student who comes by my office, they'll see kind of, I hate to make a connection of similarity between myself and the Duke because he's a pretty creepy character. But I can appreciate this aspect at least, where like my office is decorated in a way that I think it reflects my personality. I've got like comic book stuff, video game figures. I've got just fantasy stuff, stuff that kind of I think reflects who I am. Where I feel like if somebody comes in my office, they're going to look around and get a sense of my personality a bit. And I think we can also bring that into the Duke's art gallery, even though we only see two pieces. I think it's important the two pieces that we see. The first piece we see, which we'll talk much more in detail about, is going to be the portrait he has commissioned of his last Duchess. And the portrait hanging, there's an important detail about this portrait, and that detail is that there's a curtain that the Duke is able to either draw back or close to cover the portrait. And so this curtain acts as kind of a way that the Duke can control literally who sees the painting, literally who sees his last Duchess. And this was control that he lacked while his Duchess was alive. Now he seems to have control over it, or maybe he doesn't. We may talk about that. But he has this curtain that he makes sure to say that, uh, no one can see the Duchess unless he chooses to draw the curtain aside. We also see the second part. The second piece we see in the gallery is the sculpture of Neptune taming the seahorses. And Neptune would be, of course, the Roman equivalent of Poseidon. Sorry. So this would be the god of the sea. But the most important thing here is that it is a god, and the god is in a process of breaking horses. And I do think that the Duke uh, sees himself in this sculpture, he would see himself, of course, as Neptune, as the god. And I think the reader is supposed to make the connection that the Duchess would be the equivalent of the taming seahorses here, the seahorses that Neptune is trying to break. At least that's how the Duke would look at this. He would see himself as the god, and then the Duchess not even as human, but as a beast. That if she's not going to be broken to his will, then she'll have to be put down. And so, what happened to the last Duchess? Well, before we move on to that, let's talk about why the Duke is discussing, or what the Duke is discussing with this emissary from the Count. They're talking about marriage. They're talking about this isn't a marriage of love. This would be kind of like a Game of Thrones marriage of power, a political marriage. And the Count is interested in marrying one of his daughters to the Duke. And so this is really important to keep in mind, because when the Duke starts implying things in this poem, readers sometimes have trouble understanding why would the Duke make the implications he does on the occasion of this emissary from the Count, and the Count is sent this guy to kind of probably feel out the Duke and see kind of what he's like before he decides to marry off one of his daughters to him. It's confusing initially why the Duke would so heavily imply his involvement with what happened to his last Duchess. But they are discussing basically business. They'd be discussing, what would go with the marriage as far as, what each party would bring into it and things like that. And so let's talk about what happened to the last Duchess. It doesn't really come right out and say it, but I think we critical readers can read this and get a clear idea that the last Duchess has died. Now, I think it's also pretty clear that the Duke had something to do with this death, and there's a few reasons why we get this. The first one is actually a grammar reason why, and how cool is it that we can use grammar here to help our literature interpretation. The Duke uses something called subjunctive mood. He says, there she sits as if she were alive. Now, subjunctive mood is if you're expressing something contrary to fact. You would have a singular subject and a plural verb instead of a singular form of the verb. And this is called subjunctive mood. This is where we're expressing something that's a wish or a desire or something that's not a reality. And so here, when he says, there she sits as if she were alive, uh, that simple grammar, if you look at, well, okay, we have singular subject. Why isn't it as if she was alive? Well, with subjunctive mood, the were there would indicate that she is not alive. Also, we have the imagery that the flush, he talks about that blush. We'll come back to it, dies along the throat. That, for me at least, gives not only a death implication, but a strangulation implication. And then we have kind of a creepy line where it shows kind of a flow of ideas. The Duke has one idea that is immediately connected, for him at least, to another idea, and the connection's a jarring one. But for the Duke, I wonder if the ideas are connected because of his involvement with the last Duchess's death. He says that she continued to smile, which we'll talk about why these smiles bothered him, smiling at other people than him. He gives commands, and then all smiles stop. And then he says, immediately after this, there she stands as if alive, which is another reminder that as if alive is not the same as being alive. So I think it's pretty clear here the last Duchess is dead. So let's ask ourselves why. Why has uh, arguably the Duke taken it upon himself to either directly kill or issued commands to have someone kill his last Duchess. And one of the main things that we see as a source of why she would be killed is the Duke's frustration or even outright anger at her blush and his inability to control the blush. Now, stay with me on this because with psychoanalytic, it can get a little weird, but remember, it's okay as long as you can justify your interpretation. Now, think about how ridiculous it is for someone to get angry at someone else for if they blush, because a blush is an involuntary response. You can't control if you blush or not. And he seems very frustrated, even in the portrait that he's showing to his guest, to the emissary of the count. He is aware that there is a blush that the painter has captured. The blush of the last Duchess's portrait is preserved in her portrait, and he even wonders as he shows it. He mentions that it's not just her husband's presence that brought that blush of emotion to her cheek. He seems bothered that he's not able to control what causes his last Duchess to blush. And I think we can create a link, a symbolic link of a blush with a with an emotional movement. I wonder. This is where I'm getting a little weird, but I wonder if you think about a blush. A blush is caused by a rush of blood, right? The blood vessels expand, and that therefore those blood vessels expanding cause the rosy cheek color. I'm curious if this may also be a link to impotence, and I don't necessarily mean just a sexual impotence, because who knows? But it seems here, as far as you have this very, very powerful man, and what would happen if someone who usually has no trouble getting what he wants when he wants it, when he comes up against something that he cannot control? I think it's understandable that that impotence that's not often felt, as far as this inability to do anything to control something, it would be very, very not even frustrating, but just angering, and maybe even to a murderous rage, which I think we could argue here. So another thing that's important when we talk about the Duke and his identity, we've mentioned how the art gallery kind of helps the Duke's identity. The Duke doesn't seem to be someone who has a strong sense of self, and we get that as well with his idea of the value his name has. He talks about how basically the best part of himself that he gives to his last Duchess is his 900-year-old name. And think about that. If you think that the best part you have to offer someone is your name, that's kind of terrible because you don't have anything to do with your name. You didn't really create your name. It was something you were born into through no control of your own. And so it seems kind of like a blessing and a curse almost for the Duke that his 900-year-old name is a source of immense pride. Um, Even pride to the extent of hubris. It's pride to an excess, and that excess can cause downfall. But not only is this a source of pride, it also may be a source of inadequacy, that he feels like this 900-year-old name, maybe he's not good enough for it himself. Which is a bit psychological, but that's what we're doing here anyway. We can look at his hubris, as far as this man, the Duke, seems a man of great pride. Um, we see this when he is boasting about the portrait and how he controls who looks at the portrait and also who the portrait looks upon. He says, "Since none draw the curtain aside but I." So we get this idea of control and prideful boasting of I have control of this portrait. I can control who it looks at and who's looking at her. Um, it's interesting for me, at least, that this Duke character, who seems very, very monstrous in the interpretation we're going this, and it's a dark interpretation, that there may be some psychological inadequacy that explains kind of the darkness inside of this character. We also see some paranoia of infidelity, I think, and this is through a couple of images we have. Some of the students asked me, Mr. Stringfield, do you think that the Duchess really was unfaithful? And I think the answer is it really doesn't matter, because in the Duke's mind, she was. And the Duke seems a man that his reality is dictated by what he thinks and not what is. So, if you're someone who wonders, maybe that the Duchess was unfaithful, I don't really think that that's a question to spend too much time on, because I think it's important to understand the Duke in the images that he uses, the Duke seems confident that she's not being faithful to him alone, and therefore it is truth. And also, we'll get to this in just a moment. The Duke's not going to talk to his Duchess to find out if she's being faithful or not, because that would involve a sacrifice of power from him, and he's not going to do that. So we have a couple of images that, for me at least, I think conjure up a connection to the Duke uh, being suspicious of infidelity. And one of them is the cherry blossom. He talks about his gift of a 900-year-old name, but he also talks about the gift of some officious fool who broke off the blossom of a cherry blossom from a tree and gave it to her. And if you think about a cherry blossom and cherries in general, these are classically, especially in poetry, related with metaphoric female sexuality, even female genitalia. So I do think that that's the poet's purpose to make that connection, that the Duke, that it's on his mind that this officious fool may be involved with his Duchess and her sexuality. He also, right after that, says about her riding on the white mule. And this is a bit of a stretch, but it's interesting that classically, we have something in literature, and especially in drama, like in plays and stuff. We have something called a cuckold, and a cuckold is going to be a man whose wife is cheating on him, and everyone knows about it but the man. So he's kind of, it's not only the shame of having your wife cheat on you, but the additional shame of you looking a fool. Because everybody sees it, everybody knows it's happening except you, and it's either because you're not willing to see it or you're too stupid to see it. And so classically, we have cuckolds illustrated by, it sounds weird, but they would have a couple different types of headgear. And basically, one set of headgear that we know this is a cuckold man would be a man with ram's horns. If someone, a character in a play, was wearing ram's horns, that would be symbolic of him being a cuckold. The other popular one, even Shakespeare used in A Midsummer Night's Dream, would be donkey ears. I know a donkey and a mule aren't quite the same thing, but I wonder if it's close enough that that donkey ear, the mule ear, would go with the cuckold fear that the Duke has. This fear of people are making fun of me behind my back, and I'll not have that because of my 900-year-old name. And the biggest why here is the Duke is not a man who will communicate. He views communication with his significant other as a process of stooping, and he says he refuses to stoop. He chooses never to stoop. And think about how terrible this is. I mean, most love poems, and I would argue that this is a love poem, but it's just a dark consequence of love sometimes. That love, it's either he loves himself more than someone else, or it could be that maybe he loved her, but that love turned to jealousy, turned to, destructive things that love sometimes can go to. But basically, he sees in love poetry often we have the male speaker is the person who's on the ground, and the male speaker puts his love up on the pedestal, and he elevates his love above himself. The opposite happens here. Here, the Duke is definitely above the Duchess, and he sees just the act of talking to her about how he feels of their relationship. He basically says, if you could talk to your partner, and if you had the skill to tell your partner, hey, here's what I like what you're doing, here's what you do that I like that makes me smile, but here's what you do that pisses me off that makes me mad. Uh, if you can do that, then you have to risk this person, your partner, disagreeing with you, putting their wits against yours. And he sees this as an act of stooping, an act of him having to climb off of his perch that his 900-year-old name has given him, and he refuses to do that. So, there's not really a lot to defend about the Duke, and I'm not trying to defend him, but I do think it's important to look at some possible motivations. They're not good motivations by any means, but they may be motivations for him nonetheless. That he sees the suspicion grow into paranoia, and instead of, once suspicion set in or whatever, instead of talking with his Duchess about, hey, here's how I feel, He's not going to do that because he'll see that as a sacrifice of power. Um, and he can't do that. So, the final big question that students are often left with in this poem is, why is the Duke so blatant in basically showing his bloody hands to this new emissary for the Count, and possibly, I mean, think about, like, this isn't a very smart play on the Duke's part for what he's trying to get married to the Count. Because if I were the emissary, I'd go running back to the Count and saying, "Hey, you don't want your daughter hitched to this guy. He's a nut, and I think he killed his last wife, and there may have been more." Um, I think there's two roads we can go down. The first road is that he may be haunted by the Duchess, even though he thinks that he's able to stop these smiles. He's still haunted by that portrait, and when he looks at that portrait, his tongue begins to wag, and he's not able to help himself. That this is a confession through guilt. And if you think about Poe, if you read Poe enough, actually, if you read a couple stories of Poe, you find that Poe's a fan of this guilty narrator, a narrator who is a despicable narrator who does despicable things, but then the narrator just kind of confesses on himself because of guilt. Whether it's a Telltale Heart or the Black Cat, the narrator is undone by his own basic confession. And I think if we go this direction, it adds some humanity to the Duke that I don't really want to add, because I tend to look at the Duke as a bit more monstrous than and not really capable of guilt. And you're free to disagree. In fact, many people do see the Duke as someone who is feeling guilty, and therefore he uses this poem as a confessional. I think this is more of an act of boasting. He's not confessing through guilt. He is acknowledging a crime that he knows that he will not be punished for. And this is a way for the Duke to let this guy know what the cards are, to know what his expectations are for his new Duchess, and make sure to communicate those expectations to the Count and his possible new Duchess. Um, and this adds to the idea of the Duke being kind of a proto sociopath model before we really have the term sociopath. A sociopath is a lot different than a psychopath. Sociopath views people as game pieces that they can position for their own benefit. And I think that that fits very well with the Duke, that he is a fan of positioning. He sees himself as better than others. He sees himself as, worthier than others, more important than other people because of his name. That people aren't human, they're beasts. And so I think that that sociopathic tendency uh, fits a lot of tendencies we see the Duke demonstrate. And so I tend to go along with that interpretation that this is the Duke just kind of gloating. He can't help himself. This is his prideful boast of, yeah, my last Duchess, I have control of her now. And look around at my gallery. There's still plenty of room here for other portraits if that should need to happen. So I hope you get a little bit of help interpreting this poem. It's a cool poem, at least, even though it's pretty dark. I think there's a lot of themes that unfortunately we still find in today with love and relationships and destruction. And I would say anyone listening to this video, if you think of your significant other, if you draw parallels with your significant other and with the Duke, I would spend some time searching your heart and understanding that you are not a beast, that you are a human, and that your significant other is not a god, that they are human as well. This should not be a case of you being the horse being tamed by Neptune. So if you, I mean, not to be personal, but if you find a connection between yourself as the Duchess and you have a Duke in the relationship, you may want to give that some thought. And also, if you find yourself the Duke and you may want to think on that as well. Okay. So look forward to seeing your thoughts on the discussion board. Bye bye.